Thank you, Jerry. That was certainly a nice introduction, but also a unique introduction. I don't think I've ever been introduced by someone that I've known quite that long. Maybe I have. I have to think about that. What I'm going to talk about today is research collaboration. And this is going to be a snapshot of an overview of work that we've been doing for a long time on this topic. When I say we, I mean my research team of about 5 or 6 people. In fact, my research team is so valuable that I even brought along one of the primary contributors to the research team. Not everyone does that, but I wonder if Monica Gahn would raise her hand since she was responsible for a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today. And I would encourage all of you to bring your researchers along with you when you're giving talks in international venues as well. As is usually the case in the United States, if people give us money, we're supposed to be grateful. And, well, actually we are. But we're also supposed to trumpet the fact that we receive the money so that they, I guess, get some sort of credit for giving it to us. And as you can see, the work that we've done has been supported by the National Science Foundation as well as the National Institutes of Health, a few other smaller pockets of change. These are some of the topics I'm going to talk about. Some I will talk about more than others. It's not easy to get through 10 years worth of research, and or maybe even desirable, in 45 minutes, but we will at least touch some of the high points on some of these kinds of questions. Probably the one that I will spend the most time on is the last one, which is the determinants of research collaboration effectiveness, which might be more relevant for people here than some of the other ones. I am delighted to see that we have so many women in the audience because number 3 is also an area in which we've done probably more work than anyone else on differences between men's and women's collaboration patterns, the ways in which men and women interact in scientific and technical collaboration teams, and so forth. We've used a variety of methods in studying research collaboration. I'm not going to talk about all of these. We've done work that's bibliometric and publications-based, patents-based. Monica and I actually pioneered some approaches to using curricula vitae quantitatively. But what we're going to talk about today is work that's more recent and based on questionnaires, interviews, and interestingly, anonymous posts on websites, because some of the things that we were asking about were quite controversial. We were asking people about their bad collaboration experiences, sometimes what we call their nightmare collaboration experiences, where people were exploited, where people were sued, people were sexually harassed, all kinds of bad things that you'll be happy to know happen very rarely, but when they do, it's sometimes catastrophic. So the first set of studies that I'm going to talk about are derived from a set of surveys that we did that we call the Survey of Academic Researchers. My colleague, Dr. Gahn, was responsible for the sampling scheme in this particular case. And one of the reasons we were able to do so much work about women scientists and engineers is we oversampled. We did a stratified sample for sex so that we included sufficient number of women in each scientific field, even fields such as computer science and math where there aren't very many women. We wound up with almost 1,800 respondents to this questionnaire, and there's been lots of papers written by lots of people out of this database. If you go Google Scholar, Survey of Academic Researchers, you'll find quite a few. The second set of studies I'm going to talk about is more recent, and this is work from a stratified sample as well, but we also had lots of interviews that followed up on these studies, because a lot of what we're doing here was the work that was getting people to tell us about some undesirable experiences they've had. And we found that the interviews were actually quite a bit more useful for that. So we have interviews with about 60 scientists in 9 U.S. universities, all in the sciences and engineering. First question, who collaborates? Wasn't so many years ago when we had the mythology of the lone scientist sitting at the bench and coming up with great ideas and wrestling with titanic theories, and suddenly fantastic ideas and inventions would spring forth. That fantasy has been with us for a long time, but not so much recently, because the answer is almost everybody collaborates. About 98% of people routinely collaborate, and often in very large teams, as we shall see. Nowadays, in the sciences and engineering, and to some extent the social sciences, research is collaboration. There's not much of a distinction to be made. But not everybody spends the same amount of time collaborating. Not everybody has the same number of collaborators. So, for example, if you look at this, one of the things that was interesting to me was there's some loners who are still left out there. There's some people who basically don't collaborate very much. And so what are the characteristics of the loners? And without going through all of these points on the table, these are the people who work by themselves. They tend to be the oldest cohort studied. It's obviously a vanishing breed. They tend to be math, computer science, and interestingly, which contradicts the first point, they tend to be untenured and male. One of the things we'll see is that in recent years, women have been more collaborative, at least in terms of co-authoring, than men. And they also tend not to be members of a research center. They tend not to be interdisciplinary. They're focused on primary kinds of traditional disciplinary departments. One of the questions that was of interest to us is who are the cosmopolitan collaborators? Well, one of the things we knew going into this was that most people, if you want to find their collaborators, you don't have to reach out very far because they're right down the hall. Most people collaborate with people that they run into every day. But the people who do not do this are very different. So, first of all, that's what we mean by collaboration, is that we're interested in whether people work with individuals right in their laboratory, in their university, and other universities in their country, or do they go a little bit farther afield and work with people in other countries, or do they work with people in other sectors? So remember, most of our people here are university people, but many of them work with industry, not all of them. So we're interested in those kinds of ties, and these are some of the predictor factors. And the idea of being more cosmopolitan simply means that overall, you score higher on an index based on how far you reach out to other collaborators. So you'd score lowest on the scale if you didn't collaborate. You'd also score low if you collaborated with people who were just right around you. And then you'd score highest on the scale if you collaborated with people in a different sector in other countries. And so here are the findings. These are the people who are the cosmopolitan collaborators: physicists and chemists, not surprisingly, those who spend a low amount of time teaching, people who have a higher percentage of grant support, and here the men are different than the women. The men tend to be somewhat more cosmopolitan, but that's sort of mitigated by the fact that the women also tend to be younger in just about any science database. This is probably a little bit more significant question than the last one, which is, what are the strategies that people use when they're collaborating with others? You can ask yourself that. Most of you who are researchers have worked with other people, and what are the things that you look for? Are they the same things that other people look for? So what we did was we developed a scale, a collaboration criterion scale, and these points right here are the different reasons why people collaborate, or choose collaborators at least. And some of them are very, very important, and others not so important. So some of the points are very much instrumental: ability to stick to a schedule, the work ethic, the ways in which people assign credit. And then other things aren't very instrumental at all. Like, for example, the ability to mentor, so helping graduate students, helping junior colleagues. So by far the most important factor was the instrumental factor, and also just having experience collaborating with other people. That's why most people collaborate with others. The primary thing, really, if you just want to focus on one single factor, people choose collaborators because they think they have complementary skills. Not the same skills, skills that are needed for their work, but different than their own skills, skills that complement them. So one of the questions we had was, do men and women differ in their strategies or their choices of collaborators? And turns out they do. That's a little hard to read, but men tend to be more focused on instrumental and experience-based strategies. And those who have more coherent strategies, both men and women, the ones that are more consistent strategies and more focused, tend to have more collaborators. And overall, for most women and men, the people who have the most collaborators are the ones who collaborate for mentor reasons. A lot of times that's because they have people that are close to them that they're working with, they're trying to help out, usually graduate students or postdocs, and so they build up a large number of collaborators on that basis. So another thing we're interested in was just the number of collaborators that people have. So given your age, given your other kinds of attributes, what factors are going to be related to you having a large number of collaborators? And again, I'll just summarize the table. First of all, having a large number of collaborators is not related to being older. Now, of course, you have to control for the fact that people have more opportunities to collaborate with age, but if you control for that, they're not older. Having a large number of collaborators associated with being tenured, remember we're talking about academics here, they work more. One of the things we asked people was, actually Monica and I did a study on how much people work. I'm sorry though, that wasn't Monica, that was Al Lincolnberry, on how much people work. You might wonder how much American academics and research-intensive universities report that they work per week. What would you say? Would anyone like to hazard a guess? How many hours would scientists and engineers in academic universities work in a week on average? You're right, it's 57 hours. And women work an average of 58 hours. So women have to pack that extra hour in because they're women, I guess. I don't know. But at any rate, they work one more hour.
It's not statistically significant.
I know that, but that's not important. You have to play to the audience, Monica. You can probably tell Monica and I are not only research colleagues. We have been married for quite a while. People who have a large number of collaborators rarely teach undergraduates. Lots of policy implications for that one, and lots of people in universities worry about that. They have more grants. Now, almost everybody in the United States, if you're getting data on scientists, they have grants. They can't survive without them. But basically, if you have quite a few more grants, then you're much more likely to have a large number of collaborators. Now, this is a very US-focused kind of issue, but one that's important to the rest of the world because one of the major science policy issues in the United States since, I'd say probably the 1980s, maybe the major science policy issue, has been the rise of these interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, multi-university and university industry research centers. And they're a really big deal. A huge amount of the money that had gone previously to single investigators has been shifted to these centers. On average, they cost about $20 million a year. They're a big deal. Universities such as my university will have maybe 20 or 30, $20 million research centers. Universities such as MIT have even more than that. So this is a big deal, and it also really influences the way the work gets done. And we've done a lot of studies on research centers, that's probably about as much as we've done on collaboration, and they have revolutionized the way people in the United States do scientific work, including here. There's just simply a lot more collaborators among people who are working in research centers. Now, one of the things we've been interested in all along is who in universities works with industry and why. So we developed what we call an industrial involvement index, and I won't go through the creation of the index except to say just this. Some of the kinds of activities that people do with industry are very easy, don't require much effort, such as responding to a request for a paper that requires no effort. But other activities require a lot more effort, like, for example, doing research with someone in industry or developing a patent with someone in industry, and of course, huge amount of effort is starting your own company and starting your own industry. So what we did was we developed this industrial involvement index, giving much more weight to the more difficult, time-consuming activities. And what we found was that people who did well on the industrial involvement index also had a large number of collaborators. Now, one of the things that was a big issue in science policy in the United States for many years was the question of whether creating these centers and having industrial involvement was going to transform science in ways that reduced normal scientific productivity in terms of articles and such. It's actually been just the reverse. The people who work in these centers and have a high industrial involvement are more productive, and they also have a larger number of collaborators. There are some differences by gender, but by and large, men and women predict the same, or share the same predictors. They're grants active, they affiliate with a university research center, they have greater industrial involvement, and they also follow a mentoring strategy rather than some other approaches to choosing collaborators. Here's the big surprise, at least now I guess it's not as much of a surprise as it was, but women collaborate somewhat more than men. For many years, there were big differences between men's and women's collaboration patterns, and men tended to collaborate more partly because they were more established, partly because they had time to develop scientific networks, because on average they're also older. But nowadays, women are actually collaborating a little bit more than men. So here's some results from some new studies that are based more on problems and also prospects and effectiveness in collaboration. So one of the things that we've been interested in is what are the approaches to collaboration, crediting, and co-authoring. This was in part stimulated by the fact that there's been some scandals in the United States, particularly in medical research, about so-called ghost authors, people claiming credit for when in fact they didn't really do anything, and also exploiting individuals in order to take their credit in part. And so it was partly what we wanted to do was find out the extent to which this was really a problem. So some of this is just pretty straightforward, but I'll go over it quickly. One of the things, for example, in a lifetime, we found that with people we surveyed, 2/3 of their paper were co-authored. Females co-author slightly more than men, which is again a new finding. When we were studying this 10 years ago, that was not true. Now it is true. This is a focus on experience with co-authoring during a career, and here what we're interested in is the bad experiences. So what we see is that this is just as you can see, this is just a statement of agreement, disagreement. And so what we have here is whether there has been gender-based conflict, and as you can see, it's not really that common. Only about 2% strongly agree. People who did not deserve co-author credit, 7%. Now that's fairly significant. That means that 7% of people have had at least one experience with people that they thought received credit when they were not doing any credit for the work they were doing. So here we're looking at just one paper. What we did is we surveyed people and asked them about their most recent paper, because we were trying to have a sort of an anchor to what we were doing rather than asking them to project across a career. That also had the effect, since we were asking about random papers, about looking at trends. And so what we find here is that almost half of the papers have more than 5 authors. That's certainly a vast increase over past years, even in the physical sciences. This gets back to what we were talking about before. We also did another study here trying to look at why it is that people try to pursue collaborators. One reason we're interested was fair crediting, and we can see that the means are fairly high for that. A lot of people are very much concerned about that, but complementary skills is still the most common motivation for collaboration. I'm going to go over some of these things. Well, maybe I won't go over this. This is kind of interesting. This talks about how it is that people come up with designs about who receives credit, and the most common approach, 52% of the time, this is hard to see from a distance, so I'll just tell you, is that one of the co-authors, usually the lead author, just made an assessment and that was it. And only 1% is the author order random, and it's also fairly common to have alphabetic author order, but that's true mainly with economists. We also had an economist control set, our only social scientist in the database. Here are people, this is a breakdown of percentages of respondents who have had negative career experiences in collaboration, given the breakdown that we had in terms of being exploited, co-author, or receiving credit when they did not deserve it, and so forth, and people not actually doing the work that they were that they were supposed to be doing. And 78% of the people actually, sorry, hit the wrong one here. Yeah, 78% of the people reported that they had some kind of negative experience. And as you can see, people in chemistry and physics were most likely to have negative experiences. People in economics were least likely, though one of the reasons why economists were particularly unlikely to have negative experiences, they don't collaborate nearly as much as anybody else in the data set. This looks at author order by discipline. How is it that people decide what your ordering should be? And you can see there's vast differences. So for example, if we look at just sort of one individual making an assessment, engineering is particularly strong in that. If we look at people making decisions by alphabetic, then what we find is that economists are strongest in that. This is very interesting to us. 32% of people say that they have in their career experienced ghost authors. That is, they work with people who haven't done anything, but their name is on the paper. Now, why is that a problem? Well, there's lots of reasons, but this is probably the most important reason. The reason some of the federal agencies are interested in this is because people get big reputations from the papers that they do that they don't do any work on. And sometimes they become experts and testify about public policies. They get on boards making decisions about allocation of funds, and sometimes for a field in which they've actually never done any work. You can see why that would be a problem. There's actually an easy solution to almost every co-authoring problem. I'd like to say that we have this sort of very complex, magical solution that would never occur to anyone, but no, we don't. We have a very easy solution that works very well that would occur to anyone except for the scientists who are doing the work, which is that if you talk about co-author crediting, you almost never have any problems. The problem is most people do not talk about it. It's very uncommon for people to sit down and have systematic conversations during the course of research and say, well, here's the crediting scheme, we're going to agree on this, and who's going to be first author, who's going to be last author, all of that. It's just actually quite uncommon. It's sort of amazing, but then reflecting back on my own career, I'm a sinner too. There's been many cases where I just kind of assumed we all agreed. And in fact, that's often not the case. Well, I'd like to talk just a bit about the qualitative analysis that we've done on laboratory effectiveness. It's kind of hard to go over a very large number of interviews. It's easier to read that in papers than it is to make presentations. So read the forthcoming book. That's the only thing I can say, because we have this elaborated extensively in the book, and some of the interviews are absolutely fascinating. One of the things that we came up with was what we call the Tolstoy principle, which is all happy collaborators are happy in the same way. And what we mean by that is, just the other part of the Tolstoy aphorism, people who are unhappy in their collaborations find many, many ways to be unhappy and many reasons to be unhappy. But these are the factors that are usually associated with being happy right here. So if you have complementary skills, good personal relations, effective communication, the scientific productivity, symmetrical goals, if you meet your commitments, if you have research skills that are compatible, and people are team players, unselfish, and trust one another, you're golden. That's kind of the ideal set of attributes for a collaboration where everyone is satisfied. And our interview results were quite consistent about that, and our other results, non-interview results, also seem to support that. This is the model that we developed in part from the literature and part from our own results. But basically, this is what we think of as the key to having collaboration effectiveness. Those of you, if any, who are public policy mavens and wonks, then recently there was a study by the U.S. National Academy of Sciences on the science of team science. That's what they called it, which we called research collaboration effectiveness. And I and a couple of my team members were the primary consultants for that report. It's widely available, but this is the model that they and we use to try to explain research collaboration effectiveness in the United States. primarily focused on academic research, but also academic industry research collaboration. And so we assorted various factors related to effectiveness into these different types of categories, external factors such as field or commerce or organizational relations. If you have money involved in patents and intellectual property, everything is much more difficult. Most of the time, most of the things that we produce, I should basically just speak for myself, I guess, don't really have a lot of cash value. As soon as they begin to have cash value, the game changes. The team characteristics, many of them are pretty much what I just talked about before. The personality mesh is a big deal. We did have something that I put in here that my co-authors made me take out. I felt very bad about this because I really liked it, which is the jackass factor. You know, sometimes the problem is just that somebody's a jerk. They're always a jerk, and they bring being a jerk to the collaboration. And it's important to sort that out because sometimes people are a jerk in context. You know, they've got a reason why they're being a jerk, and sometimes they're just always a jerk. You know, they're a jerk to their wife, their kids, and their puppy dog. It doesn't make any difference. And sometimes they're just a jerk in the context of the work. One of the things that we've been focusing on is the scientific and technical human capital that team members bring. Collaborations are going to work much more effectively when people have a lot of network linkages, when the human capital that you bring to the project basically is supportive of one another. The part that's received very little attention in research is this part, collaboration management, structures, and crediting procedures and consensus. Because in the first place, most people aren't very systematic about this, and nobody has actually done very much work on this. We've done some work on it, trying to understand how it is that people make decisions about managing their collaboration, how they make decisions about how they're going to proceed, allocation of duties, specialization of roles, crediting, and so forth. One of the things that we focused on throughout this study is we're trying to find out the natural percentage of differences in collaboration effectiveness thought of this way. So what we assumed was that almost all collaborations would be just generally good. Some would be generally bad, but not terribly destructive, just unsatisfying. A much smaller percentage would be dream collaborations. Everything goes right, everybody's happy, it's very productive, everybody's a winner. And then, of course, what we're really interested in was what we thought maybe about 5% of the nightmare collaborations. So part of the work we did with website posts and interviews and so forth was try to understand whether this is correct and what the intensity of these various categories might be. We came up with definitions of and indicators for example, what is a nightmare collaboration? So something would be routinely bad if somebody just doesn't get their work done. That's not good, but it happens all the time, so it's routine. A nightmare collaboration would be if somebody was exploited, didn't do any work, sued somebody. Nightmares are very uncommon. This is the percentage that we revised after we did the work. The nightmare collaboration was revised from 5% to 1%. It's really only about 1% of collaborations. And 70% are routinely good. You know, so basically, 75% of the cases, you're going to have a good collaboration. Those are the odds. Although there are serial offenders. You know, there's people who consistently have bad collaborations, and guess what? It may be because they're involved in them. But most people, 75% or so, are going to be effective, good collaborations. Nightmares are very uncommon. There's a wide range in the nightmares. The other thing that's important is that is to understand this, and I'll come back to this. People have multiple perspectives about how good something is. The dream collaborations were a little surprising. They were more about comfort level and repeat business. You know, so if we look at the motives that people profess to have when they collaborate with others, it's all about task focus, complementary skills. But in fact, when people talk about their really great collaboration experiences, it's personality, comfort level, and just working with the same people again. So here's some ideas. This is my picture of happy researchers. So here's some ideas about how to enhance collaboration effectiveness. First of all, this is something we're very interested in. It's important to be careful about early imprinting. What we think, and I'm trying to do some research on this right now, what we think is that the very first experiences that people have as graduate students are as postdocs, collaborating with people. Often their advisor creates their whole collaboration trajectory. Now they can get away from it, but if they're in an environment where there's collaboration bad practices, they often perpetuate those bad practices because they seem normal. If their collaboration, their early collaboration is good, effective, fair, then they tend to perpetuate those norms. And so one of the things we want to know more about is that environment that is set for the early collaboration experiences, because we think, it's sort of like classical developmental psychology. William James, the child is the father of the man. If you really want to understand what somebody's doing when they're a 50-year-old scientist, you have to understand what they were doing when they were a 27-year-old postdoc. Cultural issues matter. If you ask about what people's motives and reasons for choosing partners, it never has anything to do much with culture and language and national origin. But in fact, going through our interviews, a lot of the problems that people had related to cultural clash. That was quite common. I'll give you an example that you probably could intuit. So, for example, if you were an American woman working in a laboratory and you're, say, 25 years old, you have expectations about relationships between men and women and the status of women, namely, for example, that women will be equal. And if you're working with people who are your bosses from countries and they're male and they have completely different cultural experiences about the role of women in their society, guess what? That can be inflammable. That doesn't work out very well. But there's many other kinds of instances too where culture matters on other domains. That's just one of the most egregious ones. It's very important to make sure that incentives are aligned right at the outset of collaboration. We found that what happens many, many times is people assume that all the other people in the collaboration are looking for the same things that they're looking for, and they want the same outcomes, and often that's not true at all, and they just don't even talk about it. If they talked about it, then they would find that that was not true, and they'd be able to remedy it. The work style should fit, if at all possible. The skills should complement. If you stop and think about your own preferred mode of working with collaborators, you understand that mode very well. Maybe it's a good idea to also think that other people might have a very different mode. And the way in which your style of collaboration works with the other, it doesn't mean anybody's bad or good, it's just it needs to be a good fit. The other thing, this could be true for almost any sort of small group problem whatsoever, don't communicate through intermediaries. What we found was that the management structure of many collaborations is set up in a way so that some people never talk at all. What happens is you'll be dealing with people who are integral members of your collaboration, and you'll work through their supervisor, for example, and you'll never even know them. Well, that can create bad feelings and also bad collaborations. Here's a few more ideas. I already mentioned this. It's relatively rare that people have systematic discussions about co-authorship, but it vastly reduces the odds of having a bad collaboration. If you just sit down and systematically say, well, maybe we should give this person credit and this person should be first author or last author or whatever, and then you revisit that as the work changes, then that helps to create satisfaction among your collaborators. This is kind of interesting because it's true and it's also a challenge. Having co-authors from different universities also reduces the odds of a bad collaboration. Now that's kind of a counterintuitive finding. Why is that? Basically what that's saying is most of the bad collaborations are from people at the same universities working together. There's lots of different possibilities for that, not the least of which is that people bring different kinds of manners and to collaborations with people in other areas. It's also possible that what's going on is they simply don't bump up against one another as much. This is also interesting. A large number of co-authors vastly increases the likelihood of a bad collaboration, even holding field constant, because some fields tend to have a much larger number of co-authors. But since we've got a steady increase in the number of co-authors. That's troublesome. But if you stop and think about it, it's kind of amazing that nobody ever has really written about this, because if you're thinking about the number of possible relationships in a, say, 3 co-author team versus a 6 co-author team, and you do the math, you can see that there's a kind of a geometric progression in the number of relationships that have to be maintained. And of course, there's transactions costs associated with all those relationships. So every time you bump up the number of collaborators, of course, the potentiality for bad collaboration is going to increase. That makes communication style and management style even more important. That's kind of a takeaway point of all this. If we're going to have more and more people collaborating in large teams, then management style and communication becomes infinitely more important than it was when we had one single author papers and just maybe 2 or 3 people collaborating with one another. Now this is something that I haven't sorted out, but it's fascinating. The study that we did, because of the weird requirements of the National Science Foundation, we stayed away from sampling medical researchers and people who are doing health-related research, because that's supported more by the National Institutes of Health. So we didn't even sample those people, but a very large percentage of respondents reported that they had bad experiences working with people in medical schools. And so there's something about teaming up more fundamental scientists with people who are medical school people. I've run this by lots of different people and said, what do you think is going on here? And a lot of them think that it has to do with the amount of pressure that's on people in medical schools to bring in huge amounts of money and produce and not be sufficiently attentive to the work they're doing, but I'm not sure. What I am sure about is that was a major ingredient in the problems that people had. So this is another perspective on collaboration effectiveness, which is kind of important, which is, and it's easy to forget this because obviously I just gave you a number of ideas about what's related to collaboration effectiveness, but it's also important to realize it depends on the participant's perspective. So one person in a collaboration might view something as incredibly successful, whereas the person down here who's exploited and doing a lot of work and not getting much credit for it views it as terribly unsuccessful. So I'm going to conclude with that, and that should give us some time for some questions. There's lots more information for this, but again, all you have to do if you really are wildly interested in this is just either put in any of these names or just research collaboration, and these will pop up. Thank you very much.